The next speaker is Dr. Anthony Putman, who says we can call him Tony, as if anybody doesn't. He's another apparently superhuman bundle of intellectual energy. So this gives you two in a row. However, like Ray, he exhibits his intellectual energy at a slow enough pace that it sinks in. 25 years ago, just to give you some examples of some of the things he's done, 25 years ago he founded the Descriptive Psychology Press. He has published a very large corpus of descriptive psychology-based works, including being in the middle of the complete works of Dr. Peter Osorio. He also did something else on the side, as Ray did. He's had a multifaceted career in coaching as what most people would call a business consultant, but you'd have to ask him about it. I'm not going to go into any of the details. He was one of the early appreciators of the value of descriptive psychology and has written some of the key conceptual papers in the field. He's going to give us another one today. It will be in response to the question that all of us have been asked too many times: what is descriptive psychology anyway? It's going to be a real treat to hear another superbly crafted and I'm sure that, again, important paper on descriptive psychology.
Whose hearing aid is that?
Oh, thank you, Shirley. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Ray and I have slightly different styles. He has diligently, for the last 37 years, every single conference, presented a paper. And as you have seen, every single time. As a matter of fact, we may as well kind of take the first slot on Friday of each conference and call it the Ray Bergner slot, because that's when he almost always shows up. And he meticulously prepares, and he often reads some of his papers, and I'm a little different, okay? I have done some papers where I've written them and presented them, but I'm also kind of notorious for just getting up here and talking with people and engaging with the audience, etc. Today's going to be kind of halfway between those two. I have a series of slides that will keep oriented, essentially. But I'm going to largely extemporaneously share with you my thoughts, recollections, and remembrances about this topic of what descriptive psychology is, and along the way, what descriptive psychology was at various points of our history. 50 years ago, it's hard for me to say that, 50 years ago, I encountered through the good offices of my friend Carolyn Zeiger, Pete Osorio and his work. And very rapidly, I became a descriptive psychologist, initially as a student of Pete's, studying as intensively with him as I could for a number of years, and then progressively as a sometime collaborator and as a descriptive psychologist contributing to the canon, if you will, but also, and in my view, more importantly, as a descriptive psychologist doing work out in the world as a descriptive psychologist. So along the way, starting 50 years ago, this notorious question, what is descriptive psychology, has reared its interesting head. And you would think it'd be pretty simple. I mean, it's a simple question, and it's always sincerely motivated. It's like, I'd like to know something about that. You just mentioned it. It's turned out to be horrendously difficult to give any kind of answer that isn't kind of or something where immediately within 4 words people's eyes glaze over and you realize, okay, missed that opportunity. In fact, it had gotten to the point that again, I fairly notoriously some years ago said I don't want to have anything more to do with trying to answer the question, what is descriptive psychology? Let me explain to you my feeling, and I think it reflects the feeling of a lot of folks. Back in the 1980s, I worked pretty intensively with the Detroit automakers. And at that time, they had had their lunch handed to them and actually eaten by the Japanese in terms of quality. They were suffering. They were losing market share. They were losing money. They were hemorrhaging. They were having troubles. And as a result, of course, everyone with a consultant shingle has a course or a training or whatever on how to do quality manufacturing, often focusing on the notorious Toyota lean manufacturing process. And so there was a joke going around, a somewhat bitter joke going around among the executives and supervisors I worked with. It went like this. 3 spies were caught by the Russians. An American, a Frenchman, and a Japanese man. And they were summarily sentenced to execution by firing squad. And they took them all out, and being semi-humane folks, they gave them one last wish. And the Frenchman was to go first. And he said, before I die, I want to sing one last chorus of Le Marseillaise. And so he, and boom, shot, dead. So then next they said, you, Japanese man, you're next. And he said, before I die, I wish to give one more lecture on the superiority of the Japanese manufacturing system. And the American jumped in and said, shoot me first, I'd rather die than hear another lecture on the Japanese manufacturing system. Well, obviously I out-talked my slides. Here we are. Shoot me first. That's really been my attitude for a long time. Nonetheless, it is something of some importance. And in particular, over the last year, for various reasons, it has emerged as a question that probably needs to be a little bit revisited. And so when the opportunity came up, unfortunately, one of our presenters had to cancel and talk to Ned. I thought, well, I would never have done this ordinarily, but let me take a shot at it. So what I'm going to give you here is a first-hand account, historical and substantive, of what descriptive psychology is. Okay. First, the question is, what is? Right? We always tended to treat and have tended to treat, because of historical precedent, the question, what is something, as a request for a truth statement. It's a truth-seeking paradigm thing. Tell me what it really is. What's the truth about this thing? And you know what? That is very, very difficult to answer when it comes to something like descriptive psychology. Just because it's not that kind of thing. On the other hand, we descriptive psychologists have a pretty substantial set of methodologies and practices, including treating things as social practices. We have that concept. And so I'm going to propose that what we consider is what is something initiates a social practice. And let's for the moment call that social practice getting clarity. That's what it's all about. We succeed in the social practice, and in fact, the person asking the question has got clarity. So what are some of the variants of that? Well, first, real easy one, lovely. This is the one that we tend to think this is what we need to do. It's what is asking for the meaning of a word. What is kerfuffle? You know, I don't know that word. All right? Many times we're in that situation. What does it mean? What is kerfuffle? Well, what you do then, if you're responding and you're attempting to get to clarity, is you define it. Maybe you use it in the sentence. Okay? Good luck with that with descriptive psychology. Then there are a little more complex things. What is, for example, sunk cost? That's where the person who's asking questions says, I know the word, but together, what do they mean? In a sense, they have some kind of technical meaning here. Well, what you do then is you define it in terms of where it comes from, it's a technical term from economics referring to, and then you give an example, you say how it's used. And 9 times out of 10 or more, when you do that, the person says, yeah, okay, I get that. Thanks, I understand what sunk cost is now. But then you get to the social practice of, oh, I'm sorry, there's a fourth, third, and three. What is Zoloft? You know, I've heard of it, but I don't know what it's for. Well, what you do is tell me what it's good for in a person's life. That's what they're actually asking for. So, Zoloft is used for this sort of circumstance, and it has this kind of benefit to people, etc. Okay, thanks, good, I got that. Now I know what Zoloft is. But then we get to, what is descriptive psychology? And what is the person saying when they ask that? They're not really saying any of these first 3 things. It says, they're basically saying, this sounds like something I don't know about. You know, help me understand that. And in response to that social practice, what we need to do is to be useful in some way. Specifically, what I'm going to propose is, what we need to do is tell me what I need to know to place it accurately in my world. Tell me what I need to know to place it accurately in my world. All right? Well, that's a little more complex than just saying kerfuffle is, you know, a big mass confusion of whatever. But nonetheless, I propose to you it's a doable task. So, what is descriptive psychology? Well, first of all, and this is crucial, I think, it depends on who's asking. Okay, who's asking? What would be useful to them to know to place it in their world? And also it depends on what version of descriptive psychology are you talking about. Wait, version? Yeah. Over the 50 years that I've been involved with descriptive psychology, the fact is, 2 facts. Virtually everything of any importance was there at the beginning. If you go back and you read the early works, person, etc., then you go forward and read the more complex things at the end of Pete's career, you will find that he had that in seed form back then. It's almost uncanny. On the other hand, it's true that many things were essentially kind of in seed form, or understood by Pete but no one else, or referenced in the earlier days, and as they, over time, they unfolded. So I'd like to give you a quick, totally idiosyncratic, personal, historical breakdown of the versions of descriptive psychology as I have seen them. And in the course of doing that, it may help you to understand where certain definitions of descriptive psychology have come from and what use they may or may not have. So, kind of like software, you know, when you get software first, you get version 1.0. And that's descriptive psychology 1.0, and that was in 1964, or 65, or 66, depending on where you really want to count the publication of persons. And that was in persons. Pete wrote persons, put it out there, and what was descriptive psychology in those early days? Well, to get an answer to that, you need to refer to some of the real old-timers, like Jim Holmes, and Jerry Feldner, Dick Comtois, Tom Mitchell. And almost to a man, they were all men at the time, they said, they called it Pete's stuff. Remember that? You might remember that? It was Pete's stuff. And one of the things I was saying is, we don't even have a good enough handle on what it is to be able to say anything more than, this is what Pete has written. And why is that? Well, because it takes some doing to really get into and understand and master in its complexity what Pete presented to the world. Now, Pete at the time, I can guarantee you I was there. He did not refer to it as Pete stuff back then. The common operating term that he used at the time was the person concept. He really didn't talk about descriptive psychology until a little bit later, because he wasn't necessarily thinking of it in those terms, and he also recognized the problems of the term descriptive and psychology and put together. The person concept is what was essentially the definition of descriptive psychology back then. And there were some papers that he wrote back at the time. They were all in the nature of things that were intended to help support the understanding of students. So we got those papers handed to us. I was an undergraduate when I first started studying with Pete. And in my first class, I got a copy of, actually, truth be told, I got a copy, a very early copy of Persons, again by the good offices of Carolyn Zeiger, who was at the time Pete's secretary? Is that the right word? Yeah, back in the day. Right. Carolyn had the task of seeing to the typing and mimeographing. Remember, we had no Xerox back then, of Pete's works. And so there was this early version that she enlisted someone that she and I both knew to do the typing. And this person happened to have a relationship of esteem toward me. She called me boss. It was because of a newspaper we worked on together. And she thought I'd really be interested in this, and I suspect that Carolyn influenced her in that regard. So she, on her own, typed up a spare copy on her own typewriter of Persons and sent it to me, which was certainly enough to get my attention. I read that and I thought, I need to meet this guy. Come the fall, I went into one of his courses and off you go. And these were things: explanation, falsifiability, and rule following grammar and behavior, outline of behavior description. There were a few others, along with some specific papers from some of the analytic philosophers. And if you're really interested, you can go back and find the course syllabus basically that he used. And these were all things just to help understand what this person thing was. This was version 1.0. And again, I stress virtually everything that we've seen since, but not all, virtually everything was there either in explicit form or implicit or referred to. Yes?
Before you go on, she may not want to claim it. She might not want to be one of you, but she certainly counts as one of the old timers.
Here's the deal. She never referred to it as Pete stuff. Yeah, so I did not want to associate her with that, but it's true. Old timer. There's also a shocking fact, a secret. Shall I tell them about you and your coursework? Carolyn never took a course from Pete.
I did as an undergraduate.
Oh, you did as an undergraduate. Okay, yeah. But then from there on as a graduate student, all the things that she learned, she did the old-fashioned way, by reading it, by talking with Pete, by practicing, by etc. And there you go. Okay. So here we are, and back in that day, what is descriptive psychology would have been really difficult for anyone to answer other than, well, it's Pete stuff, or it's the person concept. Oof, off you go. But I do want to point out that even back in the days of Persons and in Persons itself, Pete says that this is the person concept is a single unified concept that includes at least the concepts of person, behavior, world, and language. All right, so those were already completely in the picture, and the fact that it was a single unified concept, later we have come to talk perhaps about a conceptual network, because that's more common. People understand that kind of terminology now, but that was implicit, that was not implicit, it was explicit back then. All right, so, in that time, part of what, I'm going to back up before I do this. Part of what we ask about something, like descriptive psychology, is, what was its intent? What did the guy or guys or people who put it together together, what were they thinking of? What was their intention? What were they after? Okay, that places it in the world in a certain way. And here's what Pete said in persons back in the day, and I'll just read it. The instigation of the person concept was a very practical one. It was the classic problem of how to teach students something about the interpretation of diagnostic instruments, case histories, and psychological theories, and about the conduct of psychotherapy in laboratory and field experimentation without requiring that they give up their own conceptual and theoretical preferences in favor of those of an instructor. Hence, the descriptive focus. A related goal is to accomplish this within a conceptually coherent, intellectually satisfying, and substantively adequate framework, which is something that our current semantically oriented methodology and underlying process frameworks do not, in any case, supply. Pretty darn cogent to today, still, right? But that's what he was up to. It's a very practical thing. He was a professor. He had to teach students about stuff, and he looked at what there was available to help them understand these things, and he held his nose because it just didn't make much sense. So he took everything that he had studied, thought about, heard about, read, etc., reflected on it, and put it together into his own specific statement of these things, and that's what persons is. Well, then came what I'd call Descriptive Psychology 1.1, and that was initiated by the publication a bit later of meaning and symbolism. And this is where Pete elaborated on at least two things that he had mostly not elaborated in persons. One is the whole concept of language and verbal behavior and symbolism and symbolic behavior. And he also did an initial cut at world representation, where he's talking about the state of affairs system, etc. In addition, he reported on how you conduct research in this new paradigm, partially by arguing for it, but also by illustrating it. There are a number of examples of research conducted by Pete and some of his students in meaning and symbolism that was meant to serve as a, well, we're not just talking about it, here's an example of actually doing it. At the same time, thereabouts, sharing in some of the similar kind of understanding, he published notes on behavior description and outline of descriptive psychology, personality theory, and clinical applications. I'm just kind of saying those were in the same time frame, and to my eye, they reflect the version of descriptive psychology that was current at the time. By the way, if you ask what it was, meaning and symbolism, Pete said, it's a three-system system. That didn't fly very long or very well. But, you know, in the context of what he put down in meaning and symbolism, it made sense. All right? So we're still dealing with the question of what is descriptive psychology, but the picture is getting more complex. Now we get to what I call Descriptive Psychology 1.2, and that was the point at which that came about was in the publication of his epical book, What Actually Happens, the representation of real-world phenomena, which, stunningly, shamefully, is the only one of Pete's books that was ever published by a publisher outside of descriptive psychology. University of South Carolina Press, yay. Part of that was because there's this guy named Keith Davis who had some influence on those things. But they saw the merit of it, they published it in this really weird format. It was square. Why? I don't know why it was square.
But it won design awards.
It won a design award.
Because of that, you could write.
Yeah, it was for notes.
deliberate to have space to write in the margins.
Yeah. I didn't think it was a mistake. It was just everyone who's seen that book say, why is it square? You know, it's weird.
And it's also the Jungian symbol of wholeness realized. I don't know that that was a reason, but it is.
Yes. Well, as you can see here, there are differing accounts or elaborating accounts of what there was and what it's about and so forth from everybody who was there. Okay. This is where Pete deeply unpacked two things. One is well known, the state of affairs system and all of the very complex formats that go with that. But the other is perhaps less known, but also I think equally important, which is a simple statement that he then illustrated that there are three connections between science and the real world. There's the historical, there's the methodological, and there is the substantive. And part of our dilemmas have been treating things that are fundamentally methodological as if they were substantive or vice versa, and he does that brilliantly, in particular with the notion of the self-concept. Right? So, wow, lots of stuff in there. This seems to be the hardest book for people to read. It's a little bit like some of those famous books that everyone has on the shelf and they haven't read. But I mean, the truth is, it's pure platinum. It's even beyond gold. Now, if you take the time and effort to dig into that, you have an amazing richness. Although the truth is also later in the behavior of persons, most of what is of substance in here gets redone, but not all, not by any means. Right?
I put it in the category of books that you scream at while you're trying to understand.
Books that you scream at while you try to understand? Why, that sounds like persons. That sounds like what actually happens. But and meaning and symbolism. Back in the day, that's what happened. We'd read these things and we'd scream. It's like, wow, what does he mean? What is this? But that's the fire that purifies the metal.
What do you mean back in the day? Not today?
Oh, well, probably. Now, we begin to notice something interesting here. There is work that has been done, papers written and other work done, that is essentially rooted in these versions. I haven't put anything in 1 or 2, but or 1.0 or 1.1. But in 1.2, it's very clear that, first of all, never smile at a crocodile. I just kind of threw that one in because it's actually, again, reflecting the same time period and the same thoughts that Pete had, and it's different from what you will find necessarily in the book.
And it's so easy
But
to find on a search.
I'm sorry?
And it's so easy to find on an internet search when you're trying to look at topics.
Yes, I will smile at a crocodile, there you go. But there's also a whole cluster of papers that Pete and some of his cohort, but mostly it was Pete, did for the Rome Air Defense Command. And they were published through LRI, and I venture to say that unfortunately very few people, even in the society, have read them, although those people who went on to do technical work have all read them, and basically read all of them. Let's just say that there is a real strong tradition of descriptive psychology 1.2 generating ideas in work. For example, software by Joe Jeffrey, Greg Colvin, and others, and I deliberately say and others because there are a lot of people and I don't want to offend anyone by leaving them off and putting them on, largely rooted in this version of descriptive psychology, by which I mean you can understand what is going on there with just this version of descriptive psychology. You don't really need any of the other or later things to understand them.
Hey, Tony?
One more thing. And at this point, if you ask what descriptive psychology is, you would have a response something along the lines of descriptive psychology is a conceptual framework that represents persons, behavior, the world, and language in a single concept. Okay? That's the spirit, basically, of what was emerging there. And about that time, I would say most of the people who were into descriptive psychology would have been able to give and understand that particular answer. Of course, you found, when you gave it to people, that you got blank stares, or you got argumentation, or you got or glaze over. That wasn't meeting people's needs to put it in some context of their lives frequently, but at least it was there. That's what we had. Now,
do you remember the database guy that you worked with? We were trying to retrieve his name the other day.
Lowell.
Yeah.
Lowell Schneider, yeah. Yeah, and if you ever, well, yeah, I don't think he actually said his full name, but he did reference Lowell in one of his talks in Pensacola, actually, where he talked about the sucker bet that he made with Lowell about how we'll get to the stars eventually. So, then comes person, behavior, language, and the world. That's essentially what you have said descriptive psychology was. Then comes what I call descriptive psychology 1.3. You'll notice there are quite a number of years between the previous one and this one. And it's not to say that things weren't happening. Lots was happening then. But they were accumulating, and they culminated in 3 absolutely epical classes or seminars in 1976 that got published then as Seminar on Clinical Topics, Seminar on Personality and Personality Theory, and, that's actually a class, not a seminar. A seminar on Positive Health and Transcendental Theories. Let's clinical topics first. This is where Pete, in one place, articulates the entire body of what had been developed up to that point as to how to do status dynamic therapy. Basically, everything that has been written about therapy since then is rooted essentially, fundamentally and essentially, in this version of descriptive psychology, by which I mean, for example, if you read Ray Bergner's book, we'll get to what gets published here. Ray Bergner's book, you don't need anything after 1.3 to understand what he's talking about. But you certainly couldn't understand what he's talking about from version 1.2. It's there. And it's interesting that the seminar on clinical topics was not really so much a matter of Pete advancing or elaborating the conceptual framework of the person concept. It was him talking about, when you have this framework as what you're doing, and you have this framework to back you up, if you will, what does therapy look like? You know, what is the practice? Essentially, seminars on clinical topics is a fundamental document on the practices and the principles and concepts of therapy as seen by a descriptive psychologist. And interestingly, that's what an awful lot of people take to be descriptive psychology. Okay, and part of this was Pete was a therapist, he was training clinical psychologists, and there is a pretty strong bias in the direction of knowing the stuff that works in what you do. One more thing, Personality and Personality Theories is about to be published, finally, in Pete's collected works that will come out later this year. And one of the things I was struck by as I was putting this together is, this is where Pete, in very specific detail, very clearly lays out the fundamentals of descriptive psychology as it existed at that point. For the first 8 chapters or so of this personality theory class, what he talks about is, well, you read it and you'll discover essentially all of descriptive psychology up to that point, without the the details of like the basic object unit, etc. So many of the things that are being written have been written. Many of the work that's been done in descriptive psychology can be straightforwardly understood with nothing other than, or more than, version 1.3. In this I include, by the way, some papers that he wrote about that time. Religion Without Doctrine, Research, Evaluation, and Representation, Conceptual Notation Devices, the PCF and related types. Each of these in its own way is an advance, a contribution, etc., somewhat over what was done before. Many of them, like the PCF and related types, a lot of people haven't read, and it's more of a specialist thing, but it's important. But in addition, there were a whole raft of important publications and very good work that started being produced and was produced by people other than Pete. This is the point at which, and the framework within which other contributions from other people began being made. For example, there was Spirituality, an approach to descriptive psychology by Mary McDermott Scheidler, a book largely rooted in her conversations with Pete and Religion Without Doctrine and the Transcendental Theories seminar. There is Studies in Psychopathology, the descriptive psychology approach by Ray Bergner. His own experience, his own casework, in the framework that existed within clinical topics. And by the way, if I am misrepresenting anybody's work, it is, I apologize. This is not meant to categorize you forever and ever. It's just to give a sense of where things fit together. Depression by Jim Holmes. I would argue that if you knew nothing but, well, first of all, if you knew descriptive psychology 1.3, you would know an enormous amount. You don't really need anything more than that to do incredible things. All right? But that's all that you really need to understand what is in depression, even though he wrote it a number of years later. And there are papers by Ray Bergner, Wynne Schwartz, Sonia Holt, Mary Scheidler, etc., that if you look at what they're saying, you'll recognize, yep, 1.3, that's what informs these things. And then we come to what I call descriptive psychology 2.0, and I'm unabashedly pinning that on the paper that I wrote in 1980 called Communities, that was very quickly followed up by things that Pete wrote called a multicultural psychology, and not necessarily related to communities, but again, in the kind of thinking that is in this different version, ex post facto, the source of intractable origin problems and their resolution, embodiment, and cognition. At this point, something significant has been added, which is essentially the notion of community, as specifically worked out in the paradigm of community, and as specifically worked out in multicultural psychology.
Tony,
Just, yeah.
but Communities, it was published, well, when was it written?
It was written in 1979, published in 1980.
Because I remember walking down the hallway and Pete talking about you having worked out a paradigm case formulation of Communities, but he was dating it to prior years, and I was thinking, really, it wasn't until then that you wrote it?
Yeah, that was when I wrote it, that's when it was published.
But were you building the concepts and the ideas so that that Pete could have shared them with Walter earlier?
Well, let be clear. It's not as if community was something Pete had never thought of before 1980. It's in work right all the way back to persons. But it is not articulated as a specific framework in and of itself, and the connections among the various different things like world and person and so forth were not clearly articulated. That's part of what has happened since then. All right? Look at his multicultural psychology paper, and you will see that he acknowledges, yes, we need this. Fortunately, we don't have to start from scratch. This has been provided by Anthony O. Putman, and we build on that. Okay. Also, papers by CJP and work by CJP. His work is fundamentally rooted in the communities process, or the communities concept, the organization concept, which came after that from communities, etc. You couldn't make sense of what CJ's been doing if all that you had was 1.3. It's a 2.0 kind of thing. And then there's papers and software by Joe Jeffrey and Paul Zeiger, in which specific simulation of communities was taking place. But then very quickly we get to version 2.1 because that's when Pete published Place. And Place is just absolutely, if it hadn't already been used before, I'd use it for this. It's a fresh start. It is a new take on what descriptive psychology is, in a series of a great number of maxims, and in that particular volume, he explicitly brings in communities and how they fit within this whole thing. So Place articulates descriptive psychology in a way and in some detail that others don't prior. And then we got a whole bunch of other things that came about that same time, some of which are influenced by his move in the direction of Place, others aren't. Paper on pathology, an overview of descriptive psychology, 3-minute lectures on emotion, appraisal, galaxies at 8:30, the human conditions and formal aspects, and naive baseball theory. Again, all papers of Pete's that help to frame, elaborate, build out, etc. And Galaxies at 8:30 is kind of a stand-in for a terrific body of work that Pete did. He is in a much better position, I think, to articulate what that was all about. But he made real tremendous contributions, and they are acknowledged, to astrophysics and the study of galaxies. So I'm including in all of those under what was going on in this version. When?
Just as a quick point, a critic that I know in reading Place said that this actually should exist as a genre of prose poetry. That being one of the most elegant unfoldings of this, in which the language itself is so beautiful and so concise and clear. She called it prose poetry.
I'm a huge fan of Place. When he published it, it was like, wow. And as I think I represented in the introduction I wrote to Place when we published it in its collected works. And at that time, there are other papers that are being written that are in this kind of spirit, informed by everything up to this point, but at this point, breaking new ground, establishing new aspects. For example, these two great papers by Mary Roberts, Companions of Uncertain Status and World Construction. In which the concepts of status and world, which have been around since, again, persons, but which have been grown, articulated, etc., again, were further articulated, elegantly presented, and expanded in ways that just cannot be accounted for by what has gone before. And what would Pete say at that point about descriptive psychology? Well, in Place he says, this is what we folk understand about folks. This is what we understand about persons because this is what we understand by persons. And that understanding is paradigmatically essential to being a person. Okay? Notice there's an interesting shift here. That where he is focusing on saying, what's this all about? Is he's focusing on the competence of being a person. And now, wow, that's kind of new in a way, although again, right back in persons you'll find that. But the emphasis, the bringing it right up front and talking about it specifically, this begins to be the sort of thing that if you think about it and are careful with your wording, you can get some mileage with helping people to understand what descriptive psychology really is all about, where it might have a place in their life by using this. All right, onward. Descriptive psychology 2.2. What there is, how things are, being, becoming, and belonging, about 1997. Again, being, becoming, and belonging introduced the articulation of the concepts of being and belonging that were not heavily weighted, if you will, up to that point. And what there is, how things are, again, this is where Pete lays to rest forever if you read it and take it seriously. The question of privileging the physical or, thing-like orientation to the world. And then we have what I call Descriptive Psychology 3.0, which was the publication of the behavior persons. The bad news is that Pete was not able to complete behavior of persons. But the good news is that he got so far with it and did such a tremendously elegant job of it that arguably, and I have argued with people, you can simply take the behavior of persons, never have to read anything else in descriptive psychology, and you go through this, you'll really have it. Now, you might want to complement it with place because that's such an elegant and different kind of approach, but the behavior of persons is phenomenal. And I call it 3.0 because there are things in there that he articulates in depth, largely having to do with the actor's world and actor's knowledge, etc., that, again, had barely been referenced before or had been talked about in specific kinds of ways, but here he brings it all together. It includes these two. It's kind of like, I think of the late Beethoven sonatas. I mean, the incredible complexity and beauty and depth and so forth of those last sonatas or the string quartets. These two papers are like that. In a World of Persons and Their Ways, which was essentially a transcription of the last talk that Pete gave in public, and Out of Nowhere, which, when referenced, it's phenomenal stuff. Well, and now is version 3.1. 2007, we no longer have Pete among us to be guiding us, cajoling us, correcting us, seeing to it that we see that we get to where we're going with things, and by the way, just contributing massive amounts of further, it's 2007, it's like, well, will there be any further expansion of descriptive psychology? Is descriptive psychology just now Pete's stuff and we wrap it up and that's it? That was a very open question at the time. I think the answer is very clear. First of all, there have been a number of papers that have advanced our further understanding and wisdom about really important things, like these 4 by Mary Roberts. An indeterminate and expansive world, worlds of uncertain status, knowing the world and the nefarious is. You won't find the material in those papers anywhere in prior work. But it's very clearly descriptive psychology. I've done a few. I actually set out specifically in 2007 to see if, in fact, I could deliver on the idea that descriptive psychology can be something that can be made available, understandable, and relevant and useful to ordinary folk, rather than merely or just academics and specific practitioners. Wrote and presented 3 papers: Ordinary Magic, What Descriptive Psychology Is and Why It Matters, At a Glance and Out of Nowhere, How Ordinary People Create the Real World, and When Worlds Collide, The Source of Intractable Value Problems. And I'm continuing. As some of you know, last year I wrote a series of blog posts on ultimate satisfaction. I was encouraged to do a mild rewrite of that, which I'm doing, get it out in a small book sometime next year. And I'm also writing a book for the general public called Ordinary Magic, Mastering the Art of Living. It's relevant because of some of the things we'll be saying in a moment here. And in addition, we've got Joe Jeffrey and I, for example, have taken on economics, and we have published 2 papers. The second one has actually appeared this year. It takes forever for those things to happen. That are radical reformulations of economics, and they are published in good, genuine economics journals and have been really quite well received by the handful of people, in the hundreds, not the tens of thousands, who have actually read them. And this is the era of blog posts. So groundbreaking, furthering the understanding of things, blog posts have been posted by Ned Kirsch in the whole psychology and neuropsychology, is that the word? Yeah, neuropsychology world. Wynn Schwartz and his colleagues. Again, there has been so much going on that, I can't list it all. If you've done some work and people have applauded it here or said good work or what have you, or even if they haven't, consider that you're doing the work of descriptive psychology. This is what we're doing here. And so here we are in Descriptive Psychology 2015. Remember, you get numbered versions and then you slap a year on it. I'm going to say, arbitrarily, we're going to start 2015. What is it now? So what is descriptive psychology? Carolyn?
Yeah. So this is my chance to say, whatever you're doing tonight, you can share it with everybody before the business meeting, so that we all stay connected with what each other are doing, the ways we can work together and contribute to it.
It's a segment called The Beat Goes On.
The beat goes on.
And it is a great opportunity to get a sense of the fact that there's a damn lot of stuff happening out there that's interesting and exciting from a lot of different people. So come and share. Paid announcement. Okay. So what is descriptive psychology? Okay, I'm going to go through this fairly succinctly. I've got 10 minutes, thank you. I was hoping to aim for that. I really wanted to leave 15 minutes for questions, but you know how that works out. Yes?
Just really quickly, what is BP before the three-system system, the very first one?
Well, it would be Pete's stuff or the person concept. Basically, there wasn't a descriptive psychology back before the three-system system. He was working with what to call it. And honestly, Pete was not happy with descriptive psychology as a phrase. I mean, we had a lot of conversations about that when I was an undergraduate in the mid-60s. But it stuck because... Pardon me?
What were the alternatives?
Oh, well, the three-system system, the person concept, probably, I don't know, not much else.
The behavioral.
Pardon me?
The behavioral model.
The behavioral model, yeah, exactly. Yeah, none of which kind of ring in the ear.
I think you talked about that in the rap session, by the way.
Oh, yeah, he was very forthcoming about, well, descriptive psychology, it's not really good, but it's the best we can do. And I guess in my introduction to one of those two books, I think it may have been Behavior of Persons, I talk about both descriptive and psychology and why they don't really fit, but what it came to be. Now we get to the payoff for all of this. I appreciate your patience in doing the historical review. What is descriptive psychology? Well, who's asking? That's fundamentally what you have to first understand. Who's asking? Because an answer that is informative and useful depends on knowing something about who that person is. So, for example, I asked Pete Osorio, for the record, in a meeting of descriptive psychologists, that is the absolute last thing in a world of person underways. I asked him on behalf of the whole group, okay, so Pete, what is descriptive psychology? And here is the answer he gave. I will read it to you. Descriptive psychology is the discipline that is engaged in the task of writing the grammar of operating as a person among persons. Yeah. That is the absolutely perfect insider answer. I asked the guy himself, and he was talking to a group of people who ought to know about these things. And so there you go. That's it, folks. You have a little problem with repeating that in public, essentially. In fact, you may have some problem repeating it in private. I'm not going to unpack this at this point, but I just want to remind you, from the first things he wrote, Pete was talking about what we're trying to do here is comparable to people who are writing grammars of language, which is to say, we already speak the language. The grammar is an attempt to get at basically what's going on when we speak the language, what works and what doesn't. Well, that's what descriptive psychology has been. That's where he landed. And by gosh, he was going to hold to that, and that's great. However, let's look at what some responses might be to people who are not deep insiders in descriptive psychology, recognizing that if we ever need to go back to what the real story is, there you go.
What is grammar?
She's married a grandparent. Thank you. So, what is descriptive psychology? One thing we can take from what Pete said, and this is important, is descriptive psychology is a discipline. Hey, it's a discipline. What does that tell us? Well, it tells us that it has a community of practitioners, it has a body of knowledge, a body of practice, it has an intent, and it has utility. That's the nature of disciplines. Now, when you got a discipline, you got these things. So, if you're looking to answer the question, what is descriptive psychology, you'd be well served to use some or all of these to answer. Okay, and that's going to be illustrated as we go along. Here we go. Who's asking? An intelligent individual. That's who I am speaking to these days. And I've gotten some really good usage out of this. I don't say, I'm going to teach a descriptive psychologist psychology. I say, I'm a descriptive psychology, and that informs what I have to say. And they say, what is descriptive psychology? It's a powerful discipline with which you see people and what they do very clearly and accurately. Well, if you said that to certain academics and so forth, you get in predictable trouble, but I find that this gets just the response I'm looking for, which is, yeah, okay, and what do you think? What happened to the Cubs? Weren't they going to win the World Series this year? Or, yeah, well, interesting, tell me more. And it's an accurate sort. Okay, it puts it in their life accurately in a way so that they know where to proceed from there. And I put in powerful because that's the appraisal that I'm putting onto it, and you wouldn't necessarily know it if I didn't tell you, but the fact is it's powerful. It's a powerful discipline. All right, so who's asking? An academic, general academic. Descriptive psychology is the discipline, again, it's a discipline, that makes coherent and explicit the implicit structure of all other intellectual disciplines. Wynn has been trying that one out. And it's true. Now, understand, that was not the intent. Remember what Pete said about his intent? That was not the intent. But it happens to be the utility. It happens to be a deep feature, and from the beginning, that was what Pete intended and built into it. So that's what it is. And that seems like a hugely overblown, overstated claim and so forth, except that you can actually deliver on it if somebody deigns to say, what do you mean by that? On the other hand, there are other kinds of academics. An academic might be interested in descriptive psychology represents the facts about people, behavior, communities, and worlds in a single coherent framework. Looking at you, Mancoan, thinking this is the kind of answer that might be of some interest to someone who has your kind of practical concerns and interests. It's like, really, in a single coherent framework, all of those things. Tell me more. I'm interested. Or another sort of academic. Descriptive psychology provides a coherent conceptual framework for all of behavioral science. Or a pragmatic academic. This one comes from C.J. Peake. Descriptive psychologists, now no, we're not even talking about the discipline anymore, we're talking about the practitioners. What do descriptive psychologists do? They help you be more clear about what you're looking at. CJ uses that all the time, and it absolutely does the trick. People get it, say, oh yeah, what's in the proper place? Wow, could you help me be more clear about this?
Tony?
Yes. No, oh no. Descriptive psychologists organize and define the implicit structure of a discipline. But what is descriptive psychology? Really? Get out of here with that weak, truth-seeking stuff. Thank you.
Pretty damn cool.